Welcome to the latest episode of the Duncan Cartledge Online podcast, the online resource for construction professionals. Duncan Cartledge Online offers more than 9 hours of video presentations that are available 24/7 for just £7 a month. Remember to subscribe to your usual podcast provider so you don't miss out on any updates, and be sure to visit our YouTube channel for additional content. It's great to have you with us again for another episode, and as always, I'm joined by Barney, my red Labrador, who keeps an eye on things and occasionally offers some invaluable advice. Both Barney and I would be delighted if you could take a moment to write a review, because your feedback means a lot to us. If this is your first time listening to the Duncan Cartledge Online podcast, welcome. Please remember to subscribe and catch up on our previous episodes. To our existing subscribers, thank you very much for your continued support. Please help us by spreading the word. In this absolutely bulging episode, Barney and I will be looking at, if you're sitting comfortably, then I'll begin. Winter has arrived with little signs of a thaw, and completion and retention. Regular listeners to my podcasts will know my dislike, to put it mildly, of AI. Well, this week I came across something that confirms my misgivings about this form of technology when I discovered the following on ChatGPT website, one of the most used AI bots. How ChatGPT describes your brand. Duncan Cartledge Online is an online platform representing Duncan Cartledge. Okay so far. An author known for his engaging children's books and stories. The website serves as a hub for his literary works, providing information about books, events, and news related to his writing career. The brand conveys a friendly and approachable image, focusing on creativity and storytelling aimed at younger readers and their families. And then, in the small print, like one of those disclaimers that you hear at the end of a radio commercial that are read very, very quickly and you can't really understand. Information generated by AI might be accurate and shouldn't be relied on exclusively or considered a professional consultation. Under areas for improvement for my site, the advice from ChatGPT is limited interactive features or multimedia content to engage younger audiences further. I don't know really how to follow that, except to say, now children, if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. Once upon a time, there was an aardvark called Ethel, who decided they wanted to be a quantity surveyor. Enough. So, let's get back to planet Earth and kick off with a look at the current state of the construction market. There's a cold wind blowing through construction. In a recent podcast, we discussed the appeal of a career of construction to school leavers, during which the glut of architects currently being churned out of schools of architecture was highlighted. Currently, BIG, the multinational Denmark-based architectural practice, is attempting to cut 72 roles in its London office, representing almost half of the office's 160 workers, according to Architects Journal. There have been demonstrations and pickets outside the BIG London office against the redundancies, which in my experience is unprecedented, as historically, people in construction have gone quietly under these circumstances, apart from, that is, when I was working in France, when disgruntled workers attempted to burn down the client's office. Past presidents of the RIBA have become involved. But isn't this all rather naive of BIG's workforce, not to mention the RIBA, who are demanding union recognition, a 6-month voluntary redundancy package to be offered to all workers, and the waiving of all repayment of fees relating to visas and training? Surely the situation is there is inadequate work within this office to accommodate these architectural workers, and the lesson to be learned is that architecture is not all about sitting around in a studio listening to the radio and making models. It has to financially wash its face in an industry that is heavily susceptible to unexpected changes of all kind. For their part, BIG stated that unexpected project changes are an inherent challenge in the professional service firms, even with the most robust risk management and contractual processes. It's a pity that this health warning is not transmitted to students in schools of architecture. And while on the topic of recruitment, there is an interesting headline in Building this week. Just 9% of teens eye construction careers. What exactly eye means is, I don't know. Probably they look at a construction site and say, nah, thanks but no thanks. Other statistics that add to the icy blast and the lack of confidence include January's continuation of last year's sustained downturn in construction output, while the continued weakness in the house building sector was blamed by some sources on a lack of new residential schemes and subdued demand. According to the ONS, the construction industry showed continued weakness with its largest fall in more than 4 years, dropping by 2.1% in the final quarter of 2025. We can only hope that the forecast interest rate cuts will trigger an early spring. And now on to some practical stuff. What happens when a contract is nearing completion, and how is completion determined for a construction contract? It's important to understand the definition of completion in terms of a building project, which is probably unique to construction. Certainly NASA or SpaceX would not be advised to adopt it. Generally, when dealing with commercial contracts, completion is when all the obligations have been satisfied. However, applying commercial criteria to construction projects could expose the contractor to liabilities for damages and would clearly be problematic. In the case of construction contracts, it is thought that imposing onerous criteria could be seen as unfair, especially when minor but time-consuming tasks are still outstanding. For JCT 24, completion is generally referred to as practical completion, which has been interpreted as allowing a state of less than full completion, although there is no legal basis for determining practical completion, and if the works are not finished, then the client is not obliged to take possession. Under NEC 4, completion is defined as when all the works required by the works information is completed and that all notified defects that would prevent the client from using the project are corrected. This implies the completion can be achieved even if there are defects within the works, provided that the defects do not prevent the client from using the works. By definition, defects are breaches of contract by the contractor, and there are two types. Patent defects, that is to say, defects that are patently obvious and can be fixed during the rectification period, as discussed later, and latent defects, that is to say, defects that are lurking in the background, perhaps as a result of faulty workmanship or defective materials, and cannot be seen, and may only become apparent several years after handover to the client. Because most buildings in the UK don't come with a guarantee, latent defects are the more problematic, as the usual process in dealing with latent defects is to first try to establish the responsibility for the defect. This process is not easy in an industry with a high attrition rate and one that is dominated by subcontractors. And unfortunately for the client, the defect remains a defect until somebody is brought to book. How much better to have a mandatory insurance scheme covering, say, the first 7 to 10 years after handover, where, rather like car insurance, the problem gets fixed and the insurance companies go after the responsible parties. It would only cost a few quid, but surely it'd be worth it for peace of mind. So, what happens at practical completion? The contract administrator issues a certificate of practical completion stating the date at which certain responsibilities are transferred to the client, for example insurance for the works and security. In addition, half of the retention fund is released to the contractor, typically 1.5% of the certified sums, and the rectification period commences. The Certificate of Practical Completion should include a list of patent defects, often referred to as a snagging list, containing items that still need to be completed or are outstanding. The final certificate will not be issued until cessation of the rectification period, and the retention on the contract sum will be withheld until the satisfactory completion of defects. For smaller projects, a rectification period of 3 to 6 months may be appropriate, while for larger projects, a period of 6 to 12 months is recommended, although 18 to 24 months periods are not uncommon. And in these circumstances, it may be a good idea to think about soft landings. The duration of the rectification period is usually stipulated in the appendix to the contract as a period of months from the date of practical completion, and the default is 6 months within the JCT standard and intermediate forms, and 3 months within the minor works forms. Without a rectification period, the contractor would have no right to re-enter the site or building to remedy the defects. There is no reason to limit the rectification period to 3 months, because there is no connection between the contract period and the rectification period, and there is probably a lot to be said for adopting 12 months as the length of the period, on the basis that the building will be tested against a full seasonal cycle of the year. Services, particularly heating and air conditioning systems, will have bedded in. With longer rectification periods, the contractor may decide to slightly increase the tender figure. Retention has been a common feature in the construction industry for over 100 years. Yet, over the past few years, there has been a growing shift in the construction industry's views on retention and whether reform is required. The collapse of Carillion and ISG left millions of pounds of unpaid retentions and the ever-increasing number of construction company insolvencies that followed. It became apparent that the current retention system is weighted heavily in favour of those holding the retentions, while offering little or no protection or regulation for those providing retentions. Retention is a percentage of payment, generally 3%, held back typically by the client or main contractor to act as a security or as an insurance that the project works will be completed and the patent defects will be remedied. It is estimated that the total amount of retention held in the construction sector in England alone over the course of a year is a staggering £3 to £6 billion. Current insolvency rules do not ring-fence retention monies when a company becomes insolvent. Currently, retention is merely added to the creditor's pot and distributed to creditors, or not, as the case may be, in accordance with the applicable insolvency rules. Clients and main contractors are essentially given the carte blanche onto how they hold and use retention money. Consequently, it is not uncommon for clients and contractors to use retention money to support cash flow or protect project margins. A recent report found that around 71% of the contractors surveyed had experienced delays in receiving retention monies, and 44% of contractors surveyed had experience of retentions not being paid at all due to upstream insolvencies. In addition, it is not uncommon for contractors or subcontractors to write the retention off as a goodwill gesture or to encourage future work. There is also a body of opinion which says that withholding 1.5% of the value of a project is just not sufficient incentive to make a contractor or subcontractor return to rectify defects. The above issues have resulted in an industry-led campaign to address the underlying problems caused by retention and to propose alternatives. These include project bank accounts, performance bonds, retention bonds, escrow stakeholders' accounts. Escrow is a contractual agreement in which a stakeholder or agent holds funds, retention in this case, on behalf of two or more parties, releasing them when all parties have fulfilled their obligations. Retentions held in trust, and parent company guarantees. Now, in addition to the entire project completion, there are two further scenarios in connection with completion. These are sectional and partial completion. If a client wishes to take possession of sections of the work without the whole of the works being completed, then this will usually have been anticipated and stated in the contract documents, in order the contractors can take this into account at the tender and programme stages. For example, in the case of a mixed-use development, the retail units could be available prior to the other parts of the development being completed. In the case of sectional completion, the release of the retention monies should be calculated in proportion to the value of the section of the works completed, and in addition, there is a requirement for the final account to be prepared at the start of the rectification period. Any details of phased handover will be entered into the conditions of contract. And what about partial completion? Sometimes a client may want to take possession of part of the works without previous arrangements in the contract documents. Under these circumstances, partial completion can be requested, under which the JCT form of contract cannot take place without the consent of the contractor, who may not unreasonably withhold their consent. Again, partial completion usually anticipates discrete parts of the work being taken into the possession of the client at an early stage, when the same process of calculating retention releases and rectification is applied. Well, that's all for this episode, folks. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you for listening right through to the end. Barney and I think your stamina is outstanding, and we're still searching for that major prize. This has been another episode from Duncan Cartledge Online. We really appreciate it if you could help us out by spreading the word, subscribing, and if you have the time, write a review. Until next time, when I expect to see you sitting up straight with your arms folded, thank you for your continued support and take care.